Hi, everyone. So I'm going to transition from art to genetics. And I'm going to start by telling a story. So this is Leah. And when Leah's mother was pregnant with her, she learned that she was a carrier for a condition called Wilson's disease. And then she learned that her husband was a carrier as well. And this is a rare condition. It's autosomal recessive, so that means both parents have to be a carrier in order to have a 25% chance of having a child with this condition. And Wilson's disease is actually, it results from an inability to metabolize copper. And it turns out there's actually quite a few foods that we eat regularly that have copper in them. So things like kale and mushrooms and seafood and chocolate. So people who have this tend to accumulate copper in various organs. They'll accumulate copper in their brain, in their liver. And as children, they seem pretty healthy, but then as they reach their teenage years, they start to show symptoms. And those symptoms can be pretty vague. So it's things like fatigue and muscle cramping, depression, and some unpredictable behavioral episodes, which arguably describes any teenager. So her parents decided, but teenagers, to be clear, hopefully grow out of that. And people with Wilson's disease, it just tends to keep getting worse. And it can result in liver failure. So it's a pretty serious disease if you don't know in advance what's causing the symptoms. So her parents decided, okay, we'll have our daughter, and when she's about 1 year old, we'll have her tested. And they had her tested, and she does have Wilson's disease. And so now she is being followed by a pediatric geneticist, and she is on a low copper diet. And when she reaches her teenage years, she'll be put on copper chelation therapy so she can adequately excrete copper from her system. And I think the takeaway here is that by having the information in advance, her parents have essentially prevented Leah from ever having any symptoms of Wilson's disease. And that, I think, is the breakthrough and the promise of genetic medicine. So a little bit about me. I'm a genetic counselor by training. I worked here in New York City for a little over 10 years. I worked in prenatal genetics, I worked in pediatric genetics, and for 5 years I worked in cancer genetics. And it's stories like Leah's that kind of gave me some motivation to kind of switch over to the lab side of things, to where technology was making it easier to get information into people's hands, kind of, when it was a time where they can do something about it. And to put that in context, I was often seeing patients, for example, who had a BRCA mutation and were at high risk of breast cancer, but I was seeing them when they already had a stage 3 breast cancer or an ovarian cancer, and I sort of felt like I kept having to give people information when there was little they could do about it. So I think there's a lot of things now happening in the worlds of genomics and technology that's changing that. So a little bit about Counsel. We are a health technology company. We run a lab in South San Francisco, a DNA testing lab. And I think the key differentiator for Counsel is that we're really focusing on diseases where advanced knowledge can make a difference in health outcomes. So I'm going to focus a little bit on pregnancy. So for people that like to, plan their pregnancies, there's not really a ton of information about what people can do preconception, despite all these advances in genomic medicine. And so this is a list, and it's kind of typical of any list that you'll find if you just do a Google search, and this one comes from the CDC. And there are things on here that are pretty important, right? So taking prenatal vitamins, quitting smoking, and all of those are extremely critical. But there's usually this one checkbox that says something like, learn about my family health conditions. And implicit in that statement is that if you have a family history of some kind of genetic disease, then you can justify having DNA testing. And I think that's kind of loaded because the fact is that over 80% of children, over 80% of children who are born with a genetic disease have no family history of that condition. They're the first person in their family to have that disease. So that's something we need to start thinking about. And when people look into their family histories, they usually find nothing. And then they're making all these assumptions about how genetic disease is actually transmitted through generations. So Council has developed a family prep screen. It can be done ideally before pregnancy, but also early in pregnancy. And it looks for over 100 genetic diseases that you and your partner could potentially pass to your children. So as an example, most women are offered screening for cystic fibrosis, but it goes beyond cystic fibrosis. It includes all of the conditions that are common to the Jewish population. It includes a lot of conditions that could potentially be fatal in the first year of life, like spinal muscular atrophy. And then it includes a whole host of diseases like Wilson's disease, where if you know in advance, you could actually start treatment early. And so I want to talk about why we're able to do this now, and a lot of it has to do with the cost of genomic sequencing plummeting, and that makes a huge difference in justifying implementing population screening. Because before, you sort of, you could look at this from a population health perspective and say, well, these diseases are rare and it's kind of too expensive to screen everybody for everything, but that's actually no longer the case. The other is robotics and automation. So most medical laboratories are still pretty manual, and that's really expensive. And Council has leveraged technology to develop an automated lab that can run 24/7 and that can actually process thousands of samples per day. And we have custom robots that'll extract DNA, purify DNA from samples, and then track them using 15-digit barcodes from start to finish through the process so that there's no chance of sample mix-ups. These robots are actually so precise that they can target a point in space that's smaller than the width of a piece of paper. So when you think about the combination of costs coming down and automation, it means the ability to scale, and that's really a game changer. It means that anybody that wants to know important information about their DNA and use that to understand either their own health susceptibilities or health outcomes for their families now can. And to kind of put that in perspective, it used to be on the low end about $4,000 to look at a panel of genes, and it could go up to $15,000 to $20,000. And now we're talking about a few $100s at best and covered by insurance. So it's really the type of thing that, everyone can now know what's in their DNA. And that's not to say everyone wants to know, but for those who feel that, they would use the information to help their families, it's one of those things, it takes a shift in mindset, but I'm a firm believer that everyone should have this information. And part of the problem now is that a lot of people just don't even know that it's available. Most women are offered screening for Down syndrome when they're pregnant. But actually, if you look at the collective incidence of all the diseases on the family prep screen, they exceed that of Down syndrome. So from a public health perspective, you can start to think about, well, it does make sense to offer this to everybody. So one thing I typically say is, like, what good is the data if it doesn't make sense? And so another area where we're using technology is to kind of reimagine what a medical report would look like. So on the left, you see kind of what a typical medical report looks like, and on the right, what a Council report looks like. And that actually requires a lot of engineering effort to make sure that everything that's happening in the lab gets translated into a nice-looking report that, an average person can understand. And it seems kind of like a basic thing, but it's actually pretty innovative. So people can then take this report, share it with family members, they can talk to their doctors. Instead of trying to figure out what it means, they're actually focusing on the important information and what you need to do next. And as a genetic counselor, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Every test we do at Council comes with a consultation with a board-certified genetic counselor. So we employ over 40 of them. I'm one of them. Gabriel Lessedine, my colleague, is sitting in the back. He's another one of them. And our goal really is to help people understand the information. I think there's a moral imperative to do that. I don't think you can just dump data onto people and then expect that they know, what the next step is. I've actually had patients, just as an anecdote, who have done testing online and didn't know in this 30-page report that they brought to my office that they were carriers of BRCA1. And that's not the ideal way to find out. So I will end there, but I would argue in some ways this is just the beginning, that genetics really has the potential to change the way we think about preventative health. And Council's really proud to be a part of that. I'll be here today and tomorrow if anybody wants to chat about it.